Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Yes, I saw.
Thanks for being here for week 2 of the Future of Christianity in the Church. I'm going to do just a brief review. Phyllis Tickle, remember this from last week if you were here. She says, she's actually quoting, but every 500 years, church holds a big, giant rummage sale. And it's roughly true that every 500 years there have been these major markers, moments. But the question is, what does 2022, 500 years after the Reformation, what does that look like? And for me, here's kind of the point of the quote, was to celebrate. The point of the quote was that every 500 years there's something really new and big happening. But is that true now, or is it that 500 years later we're in a place of decline for the first time? I mean, compared to the 2,000-year history. So what does that mean? So last week I told a bad joke. It's not a great joke. It's not a terrible joke. But, you know, a guy goes to the doctor. He's got a lump. They run the biopsy. Comes back. I got good news and bad news. He takes bad news first. It's malignant. It's terminal. He's got a couple weeks. And then the doctor says, but there's good news. I shot my lowest score of the round at the club this year.
Only a golfer would.
Yeah. And I have told it to my doctor friends who are golfers, and they love it. But the question I raised using a medical metaphor was, what if the church's white blood cell count is alarmingly high? What if something says, ooh, this doesn't look so healthy? And can we recover? Is there a cure? Whatever medical analogy you want to use. And is the good news, because tonight's the good news, is it really good news? Like the doctor shooting his best score of the year is not really good news, not for the person who's dying. So the medical metaphor, I'm going to just briefly summarize a few of the things we talked about, and then we'll get into new territory. So I mentioned that the Church of Scotland back in 97 could put an end date when they would expire. They were projecting that by 2033 they'd be out of business if the trend continued. Question of whether or not it would continue. 2012, Canadian theologian, he cited how there were 50 churches for sale. Some of them were cathedral size. And then, of course, these other cities in Europe. And a lot of us have toured those places. You know, a lot of the cathedrals in England, there's a gift shop inside because there's no worshipers in there. And then another observable symptom is the decline in enrollment in seminaries. And even where it's done okay, the degrees that people are getting are not degrees for going into ministry in the local church. There's still people that are going to seminary, not the same numbers, but they're not going to go be a pastor of a church. They're going to do social work or something along those lines. Of course, the pandemic, I personally think, and so far it's bearing out, that it didn't do anything that wasn't happening. It just sped it up a little bit. But we're roughly at, I say we, this congregation, but across the board, 60% is about the norm for back in person. It's a weird number because there's this group of people at home that's watching, but if you're in the room, you don't feel that. And so it feels 40% vacant compared to what it was. And then there's the whole thing about the new normal for regular church attendance too. And then the last thing I just mentioned was this book on the death of Christian Britain, that he basically says that, you know, from 1800 to 1960s, church attendance just kept going up, lots of factors, but from the 60s to the present, rapid decline, and it's almost, it's down to single digits. It's like 5% in Great Britain go to church. So that's a pretty low number. So then I switched metaphors on you at the very end. You remember that? The stock metaphor. I said, if Christianity in the church, and I've been asking people this all week, everywhere I go. Now, I don't mean in Panera or something, but you know. If it were being traded publicly, would you be buying or selling? So, there's your chance. What do you think? What have you been processing?
Buy a call option for 10 years out.
Okay, well,
it's going to trend back.
I don't work in the market, so you're going to have to interpret part of that.
Okay, you're calling what attendance is going to be at a point in time in the future. And if it hits that early, it's in the money.
Okay.
So you are correct.
And if this thing keeps going down, then what
Then
happens?
you'd want to buy a put and put it back to someone else on the bet that it's going to stick at 5%.
Okay,
And
okay,
it might be a 2, and you're putting it back to them at 5,
okay,
making the margin.
okay, thank you. That was above my head, but that's okay. I mean, the thing I know is that our financial guy says, hey, look, market's not doing well, but that just means all the stocks you buy are on sale. You're getting more for your money. So you buy low and you sell high. Well, but what if is the church going to go high?
What if there isn't a high?
Yeah, what if the low isn't the low of where it's going to go?
Well, that would be the same question as whether we take out money now or later to pay for the capital campaign out of the endowment. We don't know. It's a guess.
Right. Yeah, it is. It is a guess.
If you're talking just about church, then I think we need to think about redefinitions, because I don't think in the future, church is going to be necessarily like what we think church is. I think it may be dramatically different.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that it still can't be vital, but I just think that, and I think that we have lost those people that used to come and now are watching online. And I'm not sure we will ever get some of those people back. And I think I think we just need to learn to do church differently.
So you mean like flexibility, like these coffee shops that are run by a denomination and they call that church, or?
Could be,
Yeah.
could be, and I don't know, but,
Yeah,
and I think for a church like Country Club, which is generally thought of as a very traditional, that those kinds of decisions are much harder to try to figure out how to move away from that model. But I think that's.
So then, but going to you have an asterisk that says, well, if we admit that it's not going to be the same, you're still bullish though.
I still think there will be a
Aren't
need
you
for
impressed I at
churches.
least knew that term?
The issue is, what happens, will there be a decline in the total number of churches? You know, you can look at just our denomination, or our church, or you can look at what's happening nationwide.
Sure.
And
So I've been a disciple 20-something years, just a little over 20. When I came into the region, there were 103 churches. There are 80 now. That's the most populous area for disciples in the world, is right here. This is headquarters unofficially.
Isn't it pretty strong in Texas too?
Yeah, but it's nothing's as strong as Kansas City
Okay.
per capita. And we've gone from 100 and plus to 80. So, and this is true of all the denominations. There are some exceptions around the world, but we're talking about North America, United States for the most part.
But just to put it in perspective, when I moved to Kansas City, there were also 80 churches in this region. So it's, up, down.
Oh, so there's the stock
I
market.
mean, it's. I
So
don't know
we
that
should
our
be
net
buying if it's down to
numbers
80, right?
I don't know that our net numbers are all that much different than they
Yeah.
were at 83 when I moved to Kansas City.
Sure.
I think we go back and forth, because the first question talks about Christianity, and then we talk about the church. And those are two separate issues, so you have to be careful about which you're speaking.
That is
Because I
true.
think the first has a very bright future, but like Greg, I don't know exactly what the church will
Right.
look like. And so I don't know that
So-
numbers apply.
Yeah, I agree, you have to split it, but it's complicated because if I say, okay, good, the future of Christianity is bright, but what is Christianity if the church isn't?
We don't know, that's the flux.
Yeah, true, true. Yeah,
Well, also, if you think about church and not Christianity, and you look at churches, it shrinks. And I always have believed, I think there is a benefit to offering video, but you're not having people interact. And what is one of the premises of church is to come together.
Fellowship.
To be together.
Community.
Community, and I think that, and it works at not just butts in the seats, but the kind of community things that you do that show you're a Christian. Like raising money, having, we talked in Sunday school, and we had 2 needs, voted on them, and as a Sunday school, we're But if you're not present in Sunday school,
Mhm.
those things don't get. And then you start seeing holes in our ability to be a church that's helping with Christianity in the community. So I don't know whether I'm up or down, but I think it's a big, I think it's probably the biggest problem of whether we stay or not.
Could it also be an aging demographic
Sure.
that makes up those stay-at-home virtual members? I mean, where does that interplay into the
Right.
numbers that are staying at home?
Well, and the aging demographic, there are studies to show that the church is getting grayer and that young people, I shared this last week, about a third of people who identify and grow up Christian by the time they're 30 no longer identify as Christian. That's a growing, it's the nuns and duns. So yeah, I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat the bad news. The bad news is the bad news. But I'm going to give you a little twist here in a minute.
I was gonna say, when we're talking about being online, oftentimes on Sunday mornings, I tune in as I'm getting ready to the 9 o'clock service, because I love the music
Uh-huh.
in the 9 o'clock service. I also love the music in the 11 o'clock service, but anyway, it happened that I just continued listening during the sermon at the 9 o'clock, and I gotta tell you, there was no comparison
No.
to hearing the sermon at 9 o'clock online and hearing it at 11 o'clock
In person?
with the staid white people saying amen.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it wasn't the same
strong.
sermon either,
That's-
though.
Sunday was
No,
strong.
it wasn't
definitely.
quite, it was the same sermon, just added to.
Yes, it was the same sermon, and then when he was through with the notes, then he started.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so here's what, go ahead, Judy.
I think if we were to make that decision as a group in this room, it'd be interesting to ask how many of us have grown children who have children, and how many of our grown children are raised in the church, and how many of our grown children are in church or will ever return.
Yeah,
About our own children,
Right.
and then think about whether we want to buy ourselves.
yeah.
And I think that's why
So we're the board, and we're,
if those, if those individuals, those 30-somethings now, 40-somethings now, aren't coming the way that they were raised and saw the parenting and the grandparenting, what about their kids? You know,
Although
they're-
interestingly, we have, and I'm right there with everybody else whose kids don't mostly go to church. But we have a strong group of young people
Yeah.
in our church.
Right.
So it's not everybody who's.
Sure.
It's not.
Except our kids were a part of those young people that were part of church. But when they got to be 25 and 30 and
Mhm.
35,
I
they
fell
fell
away at
away.
about that age too.
One of them did.
And then came
One of
back.
them came back.
Yeah.
Years later, when
They
I
had
said, my
kids.
life isn't going real well, maybe I ought to consider going to church again. I visited a few, and I've been coming here ever since. But I also maintain that congregations that don't recruit younger people and young families are going to die. And I witnessed it as a church that shall remain nameless when I was doing tours of the sanctuary. And one lady just kept telling me how much better their church was. And I thought, well, why did you come to the tour of my church? But, so I went down there. I went down to that little church one Sunday. And of course, they're all sitting in the back, and they don't want to do anything, in my opinion, that will do anything different to attract younger people. And I'm surprised the church, it has a little bit of a different name now. I'm surprised it's still existing.
So we attended the Disciples Church in a university town, large university, a town with a large university, and on mom's weekends and dad's weekends, a lot more college-age students attending. It was always so good to meet their parents. It's so nice to meet you. We've enjoyed. What's your name again? Trying to cover for them. But that seems to be a real drop off.
I want to look at it a little different perspective here. Granted, everything that you say is accurate, and that the attendance is declining, the membership is declining. We're seeing, on the other hand, a proliferation of mosques and Muslims.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what are they doing that we're not, that they're getting the members
Mhm.
that we're not? Now, I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is a
Yeah,
relevant
Buddhism.
question. If you're talking about growing the church, now here's a positive example,
Yeah,
and yet we're in decline now, so
right.
what are they doing that we're not?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to chase the whole rabbit because
No,
I'm
I
not an
understand. It's
expert,
a
but
big
there are
rabbit hole.
there are non-Christian religions that are growing. Some more skeptical scholars talk about this life cycle and that may or may not wane in the years to come too. But there are pockets of Christianity that are growing too. The Pentecostals in Africa and Asia growing.
South America.
No,
Yeah,
I'm just thinking here in the United States. That's
Right.
what we were talking about.
Right, yeah,
No, we never used to see mosques. All of a sudden they're around.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, we have a much bigger population too. Okay,
Well,
so,
why aren't we attracting it to our church then? If we have a bigger population and everything you say is accurate,
well, Christianity's on the decline.
well, I understand. That gets to my,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you make something palatable that is of no interest to somebody. You know, I don't know how you sell a car to somebody who doesn't need a car
Or doesn't think they.
or doesn't think they need a car.
You gotta
Okay,
plant the
so
need again.
y'all are really lively tonight. This is great. Must be the weather, right? Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to keep the stock metaphor going. And I want to give you a very, very brief history of the stock. This is not the good news yet, by the way. Okay, so Diana Butler Bass has this book, People's History of Christianity. It's very simplistic to do this. I mean, the book's not simplistic, but the way she outlines history is a little bit oversimplified. But she calls it the big C's: Christ, Constantine, Christendom, Calvin, Christian America. Well, obviously, we've just painted with a big brush. But there's something to be said for this. There is some truth to lay out. So let me just kind of fill in some of the gaps here. So you could insert another C. Between Christ and Constantine is the catacombs. The Christians are underground, right? They're persecuted for roughly the first, 200 years, we'll say.
That also was an explosive time, though.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it was explosive within how should I say it? It's explosive relative to other movements, but it was still a very, 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 very small blip. Christians were not a major force whatsoever. It was growing fast, but relative to the empire, it wasn't. So Constantine becomes the emperor of Rome. There's always an emperor of Rome, right? And he has this conversion experience. This book, by the way, Defending Constantine. If you're interested in reading about Constantine, this is a fascinating book because this guy does admit the weaknesses that everybody's always said, but he also shows how a lot of bad research has been done on Constantine. He's a much more complicated figure, like most people. Well, he has this conversion experience. You can call it questionable, you can call it authentic, but whatever it is, he legalizes Christianity. By the end of the century, another emperor makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. So this is what people refer to as Christendom. So, you know, I note there are a couple of things that he did, ending sacrifice, but mostly for us, it was the end of the persecution. Well, he also gave the buildings to Christian use. Of course he did. So the city hall would be, you know, and I always like doing this with classes. If you think about churches that have a circular apse, you know, that's up at the front, and a raised dais and interior columns, we don't have that, but we're pretty close to it. That is City Hall in the Roman Empire. But nowadays we would say, that's a church. Well, we inherited that. And it comes with it, and this is the anti-Christendom people say, yeah, you notice the baggage that comes with it. There's somebody up front who's elevated. We're all subjects. So you can kind of see the negative of that. But of course, that's not his intention. His intention is he's Christian, some kind of Christian, and he gives them this. So this marriage of what we would call church and state is the beginning of Christendom. So that's where that phrase Christendom comes from. So then, fast forward to Calvin, so we're jumping, but he's one of the leading voices. Obviously, we know Luther better, depending on your background. But the Puritans are his heirs, and they're the ones that helped settle the colonies. And being Christian, of course, as we all kind of know, this notion of Americana, Christianity, think the 1950s, think Leave It to Beaver, however you want to think of it. But this notion of it's manifest destiny. This is God's place. These are God's people. This is a kind of history of Christendom. It's the marriage of church and state, which is ironic in a place that supposedly has separation of church and state. But having separation of church and state on a piece of paper doesn't always transfer to how people perceive the relationship of the two. Okay, so then what people are now saying is, well then, and this is a hint of good news, but I'm not sure it's the good news. For some people then, the decline of Christianity just marks the end of Constantinian Christendom. So some scholars look around and go, well, yeah, but in the 50s, were all these people really authentically committed? Or was it they moved to town, they joined a health club, and they joined a church, and it was just what you did? Was it really their thing, or was it just part of what it meant to be an American? So some people read it that way. They read the tea leaves and say, you know, maybe this isn't so bad. And there are some who considered that as dead wood. I don't like that analogy. Others said, no, it's just they realized it's not for me. So maybe this Exodus isn't the end of the world. All right, so then we're going to add another C, not in her kind of history. We're going to add consumerism. Along with innovation and entrepreneurship, so you know how we've got this business model going, right? The stock model. So what if the church's obsession with numbers is more reflection of of business models than gospel models?
Definitely.
Well, that's the whole premise of this book. Okay, so I'm going to give you just the basic premise of the book. So before modernity, roughly 1800, innovation was thought of negatively. In the history of the church, innovation was a bad idea. I mean, even the Latin word from which it comes, because you'd be challenging church tradition and teaching. But in modernity, he says, you know, roughly it was a kind of a neutral term. But starting in around 2000, again, it's very hard to press the numbers on this, innovation starts to be lauded. It's the pattern for business and the church to follow. And I'll tell you some of my own experience with that in just a second. So this is what I think is really interesting. So in the Reformation, the notion was that everybody could be their own priest, and that your relationship in the church would spill out into the world. You could be a Christian who sweeps the stones that are, you know, making dust in the cathedral, and you could be a Christian who is beating a horseshoe. You could take your Christianity into the workplace. Well, what Root goes on to say is that when the canal got dug, separating church from the world, what if there was a backflow that went the other way? What if business started to impact the church more so than the other way? Or even if it was equal, what if some of that coming back in, and this is where you would switch almost to the medical metaphor, what if some of this could cause dysentery? What if it wasn't always healthy to take business models to an ecclesial or a church kind of thing? So, for instance, he says that up until the late 1800s, so basically the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th century, Christianity was not obsessed with numbers. Okay, this is our stock ticker, and this is where I'm going to go here in a minute. But it coincides with shopping. You know, shopping didn't exist. Yes, people used to have to get something, need a new wheel for their wagon, but they didn't just say, well, let's just go into town and look around, you know, and maybe we'll find something. And I didn't really need a sweater, but hey, that's a nice sweater. So this notion of shopping where you create more goods than people need, and lots of research has been done on that. When I went to seminary in the late 80s, church growth was the topic. And business models were very, very rampant. And then, of course, pastors started to have in, and regions and synods started to have into their retreats, where they'd had bishops talking about whatever. They now brought in somebody from Chick-fil-A who said, well, here's how we do it in our team. And this team thing in whatever industry it was, it really caught on because all these clergy are desperate because the numbers are going down and Chick-fil-A is doing just fine. So maybe we need to sell chicken at the church or something. What do we do? And so these coaches came in and influenced how we do church. So, and Ruth says, and I totally agree, there are lessons to be learned. It's why this church has people on its board who know business. But where do we draw the line? And where do we say, but the church isn't a business? So here's a funny story he tells. He's at a conference. He's one of the speakers, but this pastor gets up first and starts reading from an article. The church has seen closures at an alarming rate. In its heyday, the church saw boundless growth, but now decline's the norm. Things in the church have become stale. The church is connected with an America that has passed away, and few want to return to a dead institution. Innovation is the church's only hope. And he said the whole time the guy was smirking because, here's the punchline, the title of the article is, Does Applebee's Have a Future? And he inserted church everywhere it had said Applebee's. Okay, so let me keep going just for a minute and then we're going to try something. So here was my question to Rabbi Zedek after our 3 weeks with him. What's the future of Judaism and the synagogue? It's the Jewish version of our question, right? You worried? Optimistic? What do you think he said?
Pessimist.
Huh?
He's pessimist.
Pessimist?
No, I'm optimistic.
Optimist?
Both.
Both?
It's it's not his issue.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, it's always interesting to me how our sibling, out of which we're born, is a very different sibling. There's a ton of similarities, but there's a ton of difference. So this is what he said. If a person wishes to convert to Judaism, one tradition says you turn them away 3 times. And only on the 4th time you say, well, I'll let you study Torah. Maybe you can become, maybe. There is no evangelistic impulse within any of the branches of Judaism. No interest in you becoming a Jew. They're going to turn you away if you try. But they have this incredible hospitality. And the reason that's different is, even in a church like ours, which I would say tends to view itself as sophisticated, it's not like we maul some visitor and say, whatever. But there is something in us that when we see somebody visiting, we're like, oh my gosh, we're like the car salesman, like, oh my God, they're on the lot. Go get them, go get them. They could get away. Give them car mats, free mats, and they'll sign today. What kind of payment are you looking for, There is none of that in Judaism. They're just glad you're there. And if you're not there, there's no worry. None. Now, that's the visitors. So then he reminded me, Judaism is not about the synagogue. Judaism is lived out in the home. It's where Passover happens. It's where Hanukkah happens. And it's lived out in the world. He called it the street, but he said it's the world. But then, of course, it raises the question, but isn't the synagogue where you go to remember how you live that? So he said, while rabbis, he's a rabbi, right? There's a little mild concern that attendance isn't what it was, but it's just not the way they think. They don't think that way. And I love that line. He says, we're not a small group. We're a large family. So he's turned the metaphor around, right? Because if you're going to use numbers, and you could say, well, Christianity is not as big as, it's a small group now. Well, or you could say, that is one big family you've got. All right, so now what do you make of that? And then I'm going to switch to the good news, because I do have some good news. I think I have good news. We'll see if you think I have good news. That was a lot to take in, I realize. I just did Christian history and business practices, but...
Well, I think we shouldn't be so obsessed with numbers. I think we should be concerned about what we're doing and what we're standing for. And ideally, in an ideal world, but then I'm an optimist, if you're doing positive things and people know you're doing positive things, they will be interested.
And that's
So
a
do
part
you-
of outreach, the kind of
Do you get the least bit discouraged when the numbers on a Sunday at 11 are,
Yes.
Yeah.
yeah.
I just assume that a whole bunch of people are at home in their jammies on their tablets.
Yeah, but I
watching.
don't think as many
It's not the
are.
same. I have some people who claim to be.
Yeah.
I think the Jewish people and some others are much more conscious of the people, of the whole people, and them being a part of it, rather than of themselves individually. And I think our country has changed.
That's an interesting observation, because Judaism being an Eastern religion, of course Christianity is too originally, but we're very Western.
Well, I'm just talking about what our country is like.
Yeah. But I was going to say, though, the individualism that we as Christians in the West tend to practice, whereas Judaism is more about the community.
Right.
Gene, I saw your hand.
Maybe this is really simplistic, because I don't know where you're going, but it seems like the church has to offer more than Wi-Fi and basketball courts. There's too many others, so it goes with your commercialism, your whatever. And something Nancy said, which we need to offer something that's meaningful to the individual. A conduit to service is certainly it. Community is certainly it. But some sort of relationship with the divine is really why we're here. Whatever the word has or is, or those other things, it has to be different at church than a club or the Scouts or other things that do good as well.
Yeah, that's good.
Right.
Judy?
I think this kind of points to a certain catch-22, because I think this is related to the seminary numbers. I know from my own experience and my colleagues, the church's obsession with numbers is a pastor killer.
Teresa?
So I think there's three things that I'm interested to see what the church does to meet it. The epidemic of loneliness in America, along with that mental health crisis, particularly with young people. Both of those things, the church, I think, could address, but it does require community to do it, not Zooming. And then the third thing I think that will shape the church is artificial intelligence and all the technological ethics that are coming down the pike, probably here a lot faster than I'm comfortable even thinking about. But I've been reading about it more and thinking, where is the church going to be in that? So I think those things, the church is uniquely positioned to address if it wants to.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about, or Gene was talking about service, well, I was thinking, well, Rotary clubs are disappearing, Sertoma is disappearing, Lions Club, Boy Scouts are suffering. The institutional models are all suffering.
So would you like some good news?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. So here's my good news. We need a different metaphor. Because if you ask, would you buy or sell? Well, you've in a way, I've asked the wrong question.
Right.
It's not a stock. So, right? I mean, the metaphor breaks down. All metaphors do, but it's not a stock. And we're not selling or buying, and you're not going to make a profit on the market. And, call your broker tomorrow and say, I'd like to invest in Christianity. So here's my thesis. The future is really bright, just don't use numbers. Why are we using numbers? Because we're influenced by consumerism. This country is all about consumerism. Everything we do is quantitatively measured. I think we need to draw on the biblical metaphor of agriculture, which is what the Bible is rooted in, and to think more about this notion of being in sync with the rhythms of the earth and growing in a different way than thinking about growing in a chart that goes up like a graph, okay? But I have to confess, because last week I told my colleagues this. I went around to my colleagues saying, here's my answer, because they go, what's the good news you're going to say? And I said, well, the good news is the future's bright, we just shouldn't use numbers. And then what did I do on Tuesday? I was a little discouraged because there were 15 people here. Do you hear it? I'm sitting there saying the thesis is don't use numbers, and I'm discouraged in a class that's about don't use numbers because the number, I mean, but notice what I said here. That is not natural, it's habitual. is not natural. Human beings aren't born saying numerical value of stuff. You have to be taught that. I think it's a habit, but it's not natural. I think what's natural is nature. And nature grows differently than stocks do. So here's what I want to do. I want to look at 3 parables. They're very short parables, thankfully, but they all have something to do with this topic. They're all agricultural. They're all from the Gospel of Mark, which is the first gospel written, and these are the first parables that occur. And they're, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, they're triple tradition. They're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, except for the seed that grows, the middle one. So we'll just kind of read through them, and I'll point out a few things, and you can tell me whether or not this works or not, okay? So listen. A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, and since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorn grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing, and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears to hear listen. So, 3 words the people in church love: growing, increasing, yielding. We like numbers, right? So that sounds good. But in doing that, we're ignoring the other 3 soils where it doesn't always work. Now, this sower's crazy, right? I mean, you don't throw grass seed on your concrete and say, well, I'm hoping we can grow some grass here. So he's an extravagant sower. Most people would say that that's probably a reflection of Jesus' own ministry. He sows seed everywhere. But not all of it works, even though there is some growth. But here's the question. Is 30, 60, and 100-fold, is that a large harvest, small harvest, average harvest? What do you think?
Thought we weren't going to talk about numbers.
Well, we have to in this case, but I'll show you why. A lot of people throughout history have interpreted this kind of parable, and the other 2 really, as small beginnings lead to big endings. The mustard seed's really there. But this one too, just throwing seed down and then you get 100-fold, okay? But not a good interpretation. So there is a story in Genesis with Isaac's field, and 100-fold is the bounty. But it's not impressive. And in the ancient world, as I've put there, 1,000-fold, million-fold, they were totally familiar with those terms. If Mark/Jesus wants to make small to great, million do pretty good. 100, not so good. The parable hints at a kind of growth that can sustain us, but it is not overwhelming. And remember that anytime a parable is about the kingdom of God, that Greek word is the same word for empire. So what if this is kind of a spoof on Constantinian Empire? I mean, this is pre-Constantinian, but the Roman Empire, that's big. The Empire of God, it's enough, it sustains, but not all that impressive. What do you think about that? You want to hear the next one?
Michael said it talked that first week about if you thought there was only one way to interpret something. How did he say it? If you say there's only one way to interpret something, you really do a disservice to.
Yeah, I mean, you've messed.
Wrong.
You've.
One way to interpret it's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that really kind of hit me.
Mm-hmm. So here's the second one. The kingdom of God, the empire, God's empire, think in contrast to Rome's, is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself. First the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come. I used to love to read this one to my students and say, any questions? This is the weirdest parable. A lot of scholars would say this is the hardest parable there is. I mean, there's ones where it looks like an evil person is the example, and and that's kind of upsetting. But this one, it doesn't have like, this is verse 29. Verse 30 doesn't say, and what he meant was. It just, there it is. So a lot of them find this to be the most baffling. But look at what it's interesting. He's not a sower or a farmer. He's a someone. He sleeps at night, gets up in the morning, and he has no idea how seeds grow.
It says we're not in control.
Yes, exactly. We are not in control. It kind of reminds me of, and this is a weird analogy, but in Italy, when we're touring the vineyard, and we say, now how does your irrigation system work? We don't have irrigation systems. Well, how does that work? Well, there's clouds, and if it rains, water comes down. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I'm like, oh my God, you're dependent on the land. Yes, that's kind of what's going on here. And this is a playful interpretation, but I almost think, well, there's the church, someone, and they go to sleep and they get up, but we don't know how any of this works. It's just, But here's the key. The earth produces of itself. And you know this Greek word, by the way. Do you know the word automatic? Automatic's a Greek word. So there you go. Of itself. That same word, it gets used in the Old Testament for the walls of Jericho. It gets used in the book of Acts when Peter's escaping prison. And he's kind of like, well, how are we going to get out of here? And the gate opens of itself. So what scholars call that is a divine passive verb. You don't have a subject. You don't have the stated actor. And so implied is that God is hiddenly at work in the ground, ensuring the growth of crops, which of course is a very biblical concept. I mean, the bounty is always God's gift to humanity, which is why they would bring these harvests at Shavuot and what we call Pentecost, and because they're people of the land. And then the third, what?
Doesn't that almost suggest that we can just sit back and wait?
Well, again, you don't want to build a theology out of one parable, because there's a lot of theology that talks about partnering with God, or the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, healing the earth, repairing the world. So I mean, there are theologies that have said things like, well, this earth's passing away, God's in control, we're all going to heaven anyway, so it doesn't matter. And then there's theologies that, in essence, go almost to the other extreme and say, there's no such thing as God in the world. We are. Like the book I saw one time, There Is No Messiah and You Are It. Yeah. It was a Jewish book. So,
that reminds me of one of the slogans in either an AA or Al-Anon, which I used to go to. One of the slogans that helps you get by, and it's let go and let God.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're having turmoil or something, just think let go and take over God.
Yeah, I guess with the agricultural metaphor, I would say plant and care for and trust God. But you can't say, well, we're just going to trust God and watch the bag of seed sitting over there, right? I mean, that kind of farming doesn't work. Okay, so here's the one that a lot of people think is the small to great. With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable will we use for it? It's like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade.
It's a weed.
Well, are we to put in there the kingdom of God for the empire?
Between the empire.
Right.
Well, okay, so this one gets complicated because mustard seed gets used in other passages and in other parables. So we got to be true to this one, right? We got to be true to this one. And I'll show you what I mean. So, smallest of all seeds, yet when it's sown and grown up, becomes the greatest of all shrubs. So in other Gospels, there is a mustard seed that's used as an example of starting small and becoming big. That's not Mark's emphasis here. And I'll tell you why. Ezekiel 37:23 is the background for this passage. And the messianic expectations. So remember, you had Roman expectations, empire's big. Messianic expectations, they're not uniform. Not all Jews had the same view about this. But one thing was certain, the metaphor of choice were the great cedars of Lebanon. So it's an agricultural metaphor of, I guess we would say the bur oak, right? It's big, it's impressive. It's going to produce branches, bear fruit, and becomes a noble cedar, and the birds of every wing will nest in it. So you can see how Mark/Jesus, I'm doing some fancy stuff there, is using some kind of reference to Ezekiel. That's the background. But what does it say? Becomes the greatest of all shrubs.
So small.
So you do not need a pickup to bring it home from the nursery. You got a car, just put it in the back seat. Matthew and Luke, they both have a copy of Mark. And sometimes they use cut and paste. And when they cut and paste this, they deleted shrubs and put trees. So they have a different theology of how to use this parable. But Mark's is not impressive. It's a bush. But it does shelter the birds. It's big enough. So
It sustains life.
do what?
It sustains life.
Yeah, exactly. So I put here, you hear about the 900-pound pumpkins at the state fair or the Guinness Book. Got the biggest cucumber in the history of the world, whatever. But I think of it more as a modest bumper crop. It's a bumper crop, but it's a modest bumper crop. But it is a bumper. So just a couple other things. This is a really interesting book, but you don't want to read it. Trust me. But it's fascinating. So this guy, he's got to be one of the most brilliant scholars. He went through all of the records that we have from all of the, I'm going to use three words here, associations or clubs or ecclesias or collegia that existed in the Roman Empire. These were dinner groups that ate together every night. And some of them were people that worked on, at the boats, unloading stuff that had come down the Tiber or whatever. And some of them were pottery people, and some of them were made tents, like Paul was a tent maker and all these things. So there's all these records from these groups. They've got the names of them. They've got how much the dues were, how many people were there. It's incredible. So he goes through all this stuff. Well, so a couple of things there. We don't have that for the Christ ones. So everybody in the empire is pretty much a member of these things. You would have been a member of one. If you became a follower of Jesus, that would become a primary dinner club for you. Your identity would be in that. And it was extremely diverse compared to the others, where everybody had the same occupation or same socioeconomic status. So this was one of the marks of these Christ associations. So everybody was a member of that. But what he does very carefully, he is not willing to jump and just make all these inferences, but he very carefully says, well, now the boat people did this, and this group did this, and this group did this, so we can probably say that it's likely that the Christ followers would have done something like this, but he's not going to stake his life on it. He's very cautious, so he's a really careful scholar. So this is what he says just in big picture. When the book of Acts has 3,000 people saved on Pentecost, most scholars have for a long time said we have some exaggeration going on here. For one thing, if you read those summaries at the end of chapter 2 and chapter 4, they're so idealistic. There was not a needy person among them, and everybody had their things in common. Well, okay, that sounds a little idealistic. So most scholars would say that there's some exaggeration going on. As I put there, even when we have better records, they wouldn't have been 10% of the population at the most, and this is 100 years into the faith. So then he goes through all these alba, that's what these, so the singular is album, right? So he goes through all these alba, and he says most of these groups would have been 30 people. So when you say, well, you know, the church at Thessalonica, yeah, you're talking about 30 people. In Galatia, that's multiple congregations, but they're all like small groups of 30. Corinth, it's probably 18 to 30 people. The church at Corinth is 18 to 30 people. We got 2 letters in there to these 18 or 30 people. It's fascinating. Now there's some exceptions and there's some indications where some of them started to use a little bit bigger halls and buildings depending on the socioeconomics, and they might have had some places where it was 50 to 75 people, maybe even 100. But you really don't get until the time of Constantine, no accident there, big numbers. It's legal and you got a place to go that can hold them. So some people say, well, but the Bible begins in a garden and ends in a city, and that's progress. But I'm not sure it is, because the city in Revelation has a river that runs through it, and the tree of life on its banks, and the 12 kinds of fruit, and leaves are the healing of the nations. And Revelation paints another city, Babylon, which is really code for Rome, as a place where gold is more important than people. Okay, so what do you think? Agriculture instead of the stock market. Can I sell you a car?
I have to think about it a while.
Well, I mean, I already told you it was my thesis, and I defied my own thesis the very next day. It's very hard to do. It's just really hard because we're driven by this.
But it's also partly, if you think you have something really important to say, it's got to be having nothing to do with, it's frustrating if nobody wants to hear it.
Sure, sure.
So there's that part of it as opposed to just, we have
Right.
to have more numbers.
Right. I mean, on Monday nights when we started, we had 60, 70 people. Pathways, we would have 120, 130 people.
But not always before you came.
Well, but the point is, things aren't, and the pandemic certainly changed it.
Yeah.
And most of the predictors are not saying they're coming back. The numbers, you know, I'm not talking about individual families are not coming back. The numbers aren't.
You were talking about the number of times it takes to be a regular member.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying, when I was chair of the board, which was before you were, do you remember when that was?
Yeah, it was a turn of the century.
Yeah, well, it was,
That was
the year before
19th
Glenn
century.
came. Okay, before Glenn came, so it's been,
Yeah.
you know, that many people ago. And I remember somebody who at that time was a very young council chair, Leanne Jones, now Leanne,
Blendell.
yeah, saying, well, you know, everybody my age thinks if you come once a month, you're regular. So, I mean, that was that long ago
Wow.
that they were saying that.
Huh. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, it's all anecdotal. What the Pew people were doing, their research said that it used to be people would, you know, three out of 4 was regular, and then it was 2 out of 4. And now people would honestly say, I'm pretty regular, and their regular is once a month or less.
but I think, I was trying to think about this and what I would do. If for some reason I absolutely had to choose, and I could do either one, but I had to choose whether I would go do something through a service or go to worship, I think I might do the service.
Uh-huh.
And of course, but I have this thing that I really think, we talk about worship and some of the hymns of, you know, we praise God. And, I mean, that's nice, but I think God cares a lot more how we act than if we pray. Praise Him,
Sure.
praise God.
But those hymns are for us.
those things are for us too. Now, I think there's a value, don't get me wrong. I love
Sure.
the worship.
Yeah, you're just
but
saying-
not because I'm worshiping as much as because it's a group.
Right, right.
thing.
Well, yeah, like this morning, having coffee conversation with a group of guys in connections, 30s and 40s, and one of them said, I might not be able to make it because, and then it was a service thing that this person was doing. I'm like, well, that's a no-brainer. Do that. Why would you come and talk about it when you
Yeah.
could go and do it?
But that's not where we're losing the numbers to, is people opting for service.
Right, true. Yeah,
No, but I do think the people who are I think people in this congregation as a whole, and I don't have the numbers to back this up, as a whole are more active in multiple ways than people were when we first came here 44
Yeah.
years ago.
Well, to Brad's point, though, there is some research to say, and again, so complicated, right? You can't paint everybody with the same big brush. There is a generation that says, well, if the church was about feeding the poor, maybe I would, but their perception of the church, that's not what the church does. It just takes, hymns and offerings, and then you go back to whatever.
So Mike, what do you think? Do you think there's a different question to ask, which is, has Christianity ever been needed more? Right. So there's points in the history of our world where you could probably point to Christianity playing a very material change in just
Sure.
things. And I agree with the lady that made the comment around obviously kind of our condition today. And no one would. Like, I could make the claim to anyone that we're at a point where it's needed, certainly more than it was 20 years ago,
Right.
40 years ago. The other thing that I think about was related to, did kind of people get in the way of God for the last X year, some period of time, where now the church is seen as like Catholic Church and their kind of terrible history, everybody's got some perspective there, but it's not God, it's not a God first experience in most places.
Yeah.
One of the things that's so fascinating to me in my hometown is how much real estate in that little town is in churches. And I'm trying to figure this out. Like, why do you think God actually is he in the real estate business, or did he say, hey, listen, the way we got to do this, right, is we got to own a bunch of these locations. Like, you can't meet on
Tax-free
Monday
status.
nights, right? You can't meet on Tuesday nights. We all have to meet on Sunday nights. We all have to have all this terrible inefficiency, right?
That's
It's
a good
so
point.
fascinating to me, like how much change that we
I think,
see.
to your first point, an interesting thing is how society has changed in the sense that the church, capital C, built hospitals and orphanages, and now that's not a religious kind of
Now
thing.
it's private.
Yeah, it's private.
So
Make money
just
on
for the group, the one thing I did in preparation for tonight was I had the opportunity to go to 4 Walmarts on Sunday morning this last Sunday. Okay,
That was an
for 20 minutes.
opportunity.
It was an opportunity, long story. My brother has an electric car, so we have to drive 90 miles and charge at a Walmart all day on Sunday. But the advantage was, and I really took advantage of, here are people that are not going to church.
Right.
It's Sunday morning, it's 8:30, here's this group of people. Then I got to go at 10 o'clock and look at that group of people. And I don't look at those people and say, yeah, you're right. They're so happy, right? The world has gotten so good that what God has to offer, right, is just really not needed by these people anymore. Like, it's
You're
their
talking about the
way.
Martians?
No, what I'm saying is,
You're
like,
saying
it's
you
so
do-
fascinating
you do think
to
that,
think
or you
about.
don't think
I
that?
don't, but my point is, you looked at that group, you would never think that. Right? You would never, God does not look at that group and say, you know what, I'm selling. Right? He looks at that group and he wants to buy everyone. And I think that's the other part of this thing, right? Is even if we got to 1, like, even if we got to 100, back to your agriculture, it's like, listen, he wants everybody in the world. He doesn't, so yes, we do have to pay attention to numbers, but we don't have to pay attention to numbers. Like,
Sure.
we're not the CEO, right? So, like, God's the CEO, right? Or however you want to think about it, right? So, yeah, we are conduits to that, for sure. And I'm still a big believer in, I'd like to see, like, I would declare bankruptcy, I'd get better, there's clearly better CEOs. There's a lot of churches that are doing fantastic. What, some of that, there's some question, right? But
Right.
there's definitely winners and losers in the model, right? And this is just a natural progression of some of this.
Here's a question. Would God rather have somebody believe in God or live the way God would want people to live?
Uh-huh,
Yes.
yeah.
And when you make a comment that says some churches are doing fantastic, are you basing it on numbers?
No, actually, in my opinion, I'm basing it more on the spirituality of the progression of the faith in the community that's there. Not just numbers, because I think those things that's a different thing. But I definitely have seen churches that are making a material impact in the spiritual strength of their members, right? And not just, and having that, and having much more orientation towards hospital, whatever, right? All the things that this church, that drew me to this church, right? Certainly, but they're much more that model forward, right? I mean,
Yeah.
That is the place where mental health, like they are campaigning that, right, to the entire, to their entire group.
Yep.
The Grapes of Wrath,
Uh-huh.
you've all read that. It talked about this movement from I to we. Consumerism is all about the I. Technology is the I for the most part.
Right.
You got two daughters, teenagers, and you catch them every now and then doing this, and it's like, oh my God, are you taking 45 pictures of the right angle to post for something or other? And that's hyperbole, but there'll be at least a couple. And if the preoccupation is I and not we, it goes against most of the commandments, does it not?
Yeah.
Because it's about not you. You're a cog in the wheel
Right.
and a conduit to
Yeah.
do God's work.
Right.
But if the end is all you,
Yeah.
you
Well, and that's,
are-
the
blurs away.
book Scandal of Bowling Alone?
Yeah.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. I mean, because that's another factor in the decline, is that we're no longer a communal people, we're an individual people. So more people are bowling than ever, but leagues are way down, was the point of the analogy.
And that gets back to Randy's point about all of the decline in associations and organizations.
Yeah.
We don't want to do that as much.
Okay, so I want to show you just real quick, because we're over time, but I want to show you one quick. So here's a really good book, How to Inhabit Time, James K. Smith. He says, we don't need coaches who will help us manage our time. We need prophets who make us face our histories and futures. So what time is it in God's plan for Christianity and the church is very hard to tell. It's always been hard to tell. I'm not a prophet, I can't tell you. But I do like this. In every one of Root's 5 volumes, this is the 5th one, he always ends with this: waiting on God to show us what's next. So you plant, but you wait. And I think our partners in the Northeast, good example, but I can't help but think, what is this partnership with Ward Parkway doing to us? I don't know. I mean, some people would say, let's make that happen. But Ruth's point is, you stay active in the world, but you just wait for God to reveal this epiphany. So, that's an interesting kind of notion. But I do think instead of buying and selling, I'm going to try to think about planting, watering, feeding, tending, harvesting, dirt under the fingernails, hands in the soil. And then I love this quote. Luther said, even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. So, anyway. Okay, you had a comment, question?
Just an observation, and
Sure.
I've never been able to figure out why. I find that when we're at 901 with the crazies and the motorcycles and everything else.
Oh, the
we're
outdoor.
outside.
Yeah.
And people come a little late, they don't come. There is a communion outside that we don't replicate the minute we come back in, because then people, they sit in their
Interesting.
pews, everybody sits there on the ground, it's that wonderful chaos, but they're here for the right reason.
Interesting. And we're We're on the ground, too.
The agricultural.
Well,
There you go.
I think some of it is that, but what
That's
is it about
interesting.
that service that, and
Too
we
damn
get
right.
150 people
I know.
that come on Sunday morning and sit out there and wait until the sun gets us and then we start sweating. But there's I chair it, and there is just a total different
That's true.
mindset of when people show up at 9:01.
Did you say there's
Yeah.
150 people?
No, 100.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because personally, I would prefer to eat on a patio anytime as opposed to indoors. Well, what is that? I mean, is that some kind of nature thing? I don't know. Maybe that's just my preference. My son would prefer the opposite. He's not in church either, though.
But, is that a
Yeah,
blueprint?
it's
What
interesting.
elements of that could be a blueprint for?
Yeah, I don't know.
I think we'll redesign the roof and have it be retracted.
There you go.
It's a new capital raise.
Yes.
Well, I hope.
The fact you said it started in the garden and we've ended in the garden, I mean, it so fits with our, the ecology that we should be facing.
Yes.
If you read about the Native Americans who were
Yeah.
so hooked to the seasons and Mother Earth and
Yeah.
creation and nature and whatever.
Well,
it's
I'm
like
ordering a
we need to
book.
return, but it's not really going backwards.
I'm ordering a book on the Wood Wide Web
Yes.
instead of the World Wide Web.
Yes.
Well, this was fun and it was interesting, so thanks for putting up with me.